So in the last lesson, we have seen how to connect to the Windows virtual machine and Linux virtual machine. And we understood how to stop, restart, start the virtual machines. So in this lesson, we'll try to understand how do we manage Azure virtual machines and what options are available. So sometimes we call them as an day two operations. So we'll try to understand. So how do we resize the VM? So initially during the deployment, we might have given some size. Then how can we add additional disks and what type of disks are being supported? And we'll understand the feature called as an auto shutdown, a run command, and Windows Admin Center and a backup features. So when we look at the VM size, so during the creation of a virtual machine, we might have selected maybe a size like a D2VS, which might be giving a 2 processors with an 8 GB RAM. 8 GB RAM. For some reasons, this capacity is not sufficient for the virtual machine, or we might have been oversized this virtual machine. So we want to resize the hardware capacity from a perspective of a process and memory. So Azure allows to increase or basically decrease the capacities. So we can allows to change basically the VM size, either to downscale or upscale the capacity, scale the capacity. So we can choose a higher capacity size, or we can choose a lower capacity size. Accordingly, the VM is going to get the new capacity. Now, what is the challenge with this one, isn't? So during the resize of a virtual machine, the VM will gets reboot. So whenever we want to change the size of the virtual machine, so we need to ensure that there is a downtime for your virtual machine, and you can reboot the virtual machine. So either you decrease the capacity or increase the capacity, the virtual machine will get a reboot. So be careful when you're doing this operation. So let me go to the Azure portal. So let's go to the virtual machines. So I'm creating a virtual machine. So I'm creating a resource group called as an IPN web. Virtual machine name I'm saying called as an API VM1. I'm selecting Central India. So I'm selecting a zone 1. So let me select a Windows Server 2019 data center. Now I see a size. So I'm selecting a standard, or I'm just choosing all the sizes. So I'll go with a B2MS, so which has a 2 process with 8 GB RAM. So I'm giving the user name and the password to create the virtual machine. So I'm saying review and create. Let's wait for a few minutes. So we have the virtual machine deployed. Let's go to the virtual machine. So we see the VM size standard B2MS, 2 CPUs with 8 GB RAM. So let's wait for this VM to come up. So let me take the public IP and let me try to connect to do an RDP to this machine. So here we can see processors Intel Xeon Platinum 8270L 2.6 gigahertz and installed memory is in 7.95 GB. So it is basically an 8 GB capacity. Let me go to the device manager. So when I go to processors, we see two processors. So as it has been allocated 2 CPUs with 8 GB RAM. So when I log into the guest operating system, that is in a VM operating system, we see two processors with an 8 GB RAM, which is allocated. Now I want to change this size. So on the virtual machine menu panel, so we would find size, click on the size. Then you'll be able to find the new sizes. So currently it is under the B2MS. Now I want to select the B4MS. So I'm saying resize. Do you want to resize the size? It's currently running state. Changing its size will cause to be restarted. So the VM will get reboot to get the new hardware configurations effective. Now the virtual machine got resized. Now let's go to the overview. Still it is showing you this one. Let me close this panel and reopen this. Still I would see two CPUs. Maybe it still is not reflected. But let me take the public IP. In the GUI, it will take some time to get reflect sometimes. Now we can see the installed RAM is in 16 GB. And let's go to the device manager and see the number of processors. We can see 4 processors. So now the hardware capacity got upgraded from a 2 to 4 processors and from an 8 GB RAM to 16 GB RAM. It's showing standard B4 MS, but this is not reflecting. Okay. Now we can also downgrade it. Yeah. Now we can see 4 CPUs with 16 GB RAM. Now I can go and reduce the capacity anytime. Size. Now I want to go with a 2 processors with a 4 GB RAM. Either you downgrade it, whether you upgrade it, the machine will get reboot. VM got resized. Let me go to the overview. Still it's showing the old one. Let me take the public IP. So we reduced the 4 GB. Now we can see 4 GB. Let's go to the device manager. We can see 2 processors. So that way we can, at any given point of time, we can resize the virtual machine. So let me put it to the 4 CPUs. Still, it is not reflecting the new size. Let's wait for a minute. Let me reset to the 2 process with 8 GB RAM. So that's how we can basically resize the virtual machines. So let's understand the disks. Now during the creation of a virtual machine, we choose the size, VM size. So based on the VM size, by default, there will be OS disk will be attached to the VM. By default, there will be an a OS disk. And the OS disk will be around 128 GB for most of the sizes. So the OS disk will vary based on the VM size and operating system image. So if you choose a Linux image, then the operating system disk will not be 128 GB. If you choose a Windows Server 2022, the OS disk will not be 128 GB. Now, typically, if you choose Windows Server 2016 or 2019, so by default, it will be a size of 128 GB. So that is the default allocated capacity. So at any given point of time, we can increase the OS disk. So OS disk, so can be increased at any given point of time, but we cannot decrease the capacity size. So we can increase the capacity of the OS disk, but we cannot decrease the size. So once you increase it, if you want to come back, you cannot come back. So always the disk can be only increased, but cannot be decreased. So in order to increase the OS disk, the VM should be in a shutdown state. Shutdown state. So when a virtual machine is up and running, we cannot increase the size of the VM disk, OS disk. So we should shut down the virtual machine in order to increase the OS disk. So I'm just going to the virtual machine properties, then go to the disks. We see OS disk, so which is of 127 GB. Click on this particular disk. So we would get a storage type premium SSD. I'll come back to that. And in which zone it is created, and performance tier, availability zone, and everything. Now we can see called as a size and performance. So click on size and performance. Now it is allocated 128 GB capacity. Now I want to increase to 256 GB. So I'm not able to increase it because the VM is up and running. So in order to change the size of the OS disk, I need to shut down. So before that, let's go and check in the VM. Also, let me go to the disk management. So when I go to the disk management, we see a size of 126 GB. So as a physical capacity has been allocated of 128 GB, but to the OS, it is basically appearing as a 127 GB. Now let me go and shut down the VM. Stop the virtual machine. Let's wait for the VM come to stop. Now we can see stopped allocated. Now click on the VM, go to the disks section, select the OS, click on the OS disk, go to the size plus performance. Now 128 GB, now I'm selecting a 256 GB. I'm saying save it. Now the size of the disk got increased from 128 GB to 256 GB. But the C drive will not get increase. Only the physical, the nothing but the hard disk capacity got increased. Now let me close it. Let me go to the virtual machine and start the virtual machine. Let me connect to the OS. So let's go to the disk management. Go to the disk management. Now we can see the disk is at 255 19. There's 256 GB. Now the C drive is 126 GB only. So there we can see unallocated space is another 129 GB. Now you can click on C drive and you can basically extend the volume and fullest capacity. Now the C drive capacity got increased to the 256 GB. So when I go and see the drive in my computer, we should be able to see called as a 255 GB. Now, as I said earlier, this is a temporary disk. Based on the VM size, the size of the D drive will get vary. And every time when we power off the virtual machine, stop the virtual machine, the D drive will get detached and deleted. Now let's understand data disks. So data disks, nothing but it's called as an additional hard disks, or basically called as disks for a VM. No. Typically, we don't prefer to install applications in the C drive. So the applications may demand having additional disks, and some applications demand multiple hard disks, okay, where they split the disks into multiple things to avoid the performance issues. Now, the Azure virtual machines can have multiple additional hard disks. The number of hard disks is depend on the VM size. So based on the VM size, so it will tell you that, hey, this VM, you can have up to maximum of 4 data disks. For this particular VM size, you can have up to 16 data disks. For this capacity of VM, you can have up to 8 data disks like that. Okay, so before creation of a virtual machine, And if you feel that there is a need for a more number of hard disks, then you can check which particular size is basically providing you that capacity. Now in the data disks, there are two things. One is a locally redundant hard disks, zone redundant hard disks. Now we have a central India as a region. Within the central India, you have three zones. You have three zones, a zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3. Now this is my zone 1, this is my zone 2, and this is my zone 3. And this is our central India, a region called as a central India. So locally redundant hard disk means if we have created a virtual machine in a zone 1, in the backend, that virtual hard disk will be replicated into 3 different physical storage devices. By any chance, if one physical storage device goes down, there is no impact on your virtual machine hard disk, because it is making a 3 different copies of your virtual hard disk within the same data center or a zone. That is what we call it locally redundant hard disks. Locally redundant hard disk. Now, what is this zone redundant hard disks? A zone redundant hard disk is when I create a virtual machine or a disk, that disk is being created in a zone 1, and one more copy of this disk is being maintained in another zone. In the source zone, there will be 2 copies, and third copy of the being maintained in the another zone. Now, what is the advantage of this one? For some reasons, something happened to the 2 physical storage devices in the zone 1. Still, we have a virtual hard disk available in zone 2, because zone 1 and zone 2 and zone 3 are completely physically isolated from a failure. But when we choose a zone redundant hard disk, there is some cost additional because it has to replicate across the zones. So there is some additional cost based on the amount of data which needs to be replicated. But a locally redundant hard disk, by default, the 3 copies are being included in the cost. So we don't need to explicitly pay for it. Now, in the locally redundant or anything, you have called as a disk types, called as a standard HDD, standard SDD, premium SSD. There are kind of disks available. Now, based on the performance to performance, we can choose the type of the disk. Now go to the virtual machine at disks. Down we can see called as the data disks. Create and attach a new disk. So you can create a disk. Name of the disk, I'm giving it called as a data disk 1. Now storage type. So click on that. Locally redundant storage, premium SSD V2, standard SSD, standard HDD. Standard HDD, the backend storage is an SATA disk. This SAS hard disks. Standard SSD, basically called as the backend storage is an SSD based storage, but which gives certain performance compared to the HDDs. And we can see premium SSD V2 as is suggesting the require low latency and high operation throughput. Now, if you have applications required some high IO ops and better throughput from the disk, then we can go with the premium SSD V2. And a normal base kind of a production kind of an applications, we can go with premium SSD. Now, there is a cost. The standard HDD hard disk is cheaper compared to your premium SSD, a V2 or premium SSD. Okay, so based on requirement, we can choose it. I'm selecting the standard HDD. And what is the size of the disk you want it? So I'm giving it the size is basically called as a 256 GB size. Now click on apply. Now it is going to create a new disk and attach that disk to the virtual machine. Creating a data disk does not require a reboot of the virtual machine. So when a virtual machine is running, we can add the data disks and we can detach the data disks from the virtual machine. So I go to the virtual machine. I go to the disk management called as a rescan disks. Now we can see here a disk to unknown size, which is of basically a 256 GB. And typically how we do it in anywhere in the operating system, we have to initialize the disk and we can create a partition and we can use it. Now I see that there is an E drive, which is of 256 GB capacity. Now I can create one more hard disk and I'm calling it as some data, a disk 2. I'm giving a premium SSD and I'm giving it 128 GB. It is not necessary that all the disks should be of the same storage type. So you can have one disk within a standard SSD and another disk as a premium SSD based on our performance requirements. Now, when you delete the virtual machine, by default, the OS disk will be deleted, but the data disks will not get deleted. Now, let me go to the go to the disk management and say rescan disks. Now I can see disk 3, which is of unknown. Now I can initialize it and create a partition. And you can use that disk. Now we can see called as an F drive. Like this, you can create multiple hard disks and attach this VM. Now, when we delete the virtual machine, it only deletes the OS disks. Now go to the section called as a disks. So we will be able to see the list of disks of all the virtual machines which are available in your subscription or this account. So go to the search and say disks. Disks are basically independent components. Now I see OS disk, a data disk, and data disk 2, the size of the disk, to which particular virtual machine they connected. And they are available under which resource group, under which location. Under which location. Now I'm going to the virtual machine. I'm going to the disks. So I can detach this disk. So we can say detach and apply. So I remove the data disk 2 from the virtual machine. Now I go to the OS. I don't see an F drive because we detached the disk. Now let's go to the disks. We see still the disk is existing. So we have not deleted the disk permanently from the Azure. We have only detached the disk from the virtual machine. So still that disk will exist in the Azure environment. The Azure environment. Now what we need to do now? Now we can see data disk 2 is not attached to any virtual machine. If a disk is being attached to any of the virtual machine, we cannot delete it. If the disk is not attached to any of the virtual machine, then we can basically click and we can delete this disk. We can delete this disk. Now, I go to the virtual machine. Go to the virtual machine. Disks. So we can attach the existing disk. So I can go to attach disks. Then you can choose the disk which is not attached to any of the virtual machine. Now we can see data disk 2. The data will not be lost when we detach the disk. As long as the disk exists in Azure and there is some data, the data will exist. Now this way, if you already have a disk existing in your disks and which is not connected to any of the virtual machine, then you can go to the virtual machine disk and click on attach existing disk and you can attach the disk. I'm just going to the virtual machine. I'm deleting the virtual machine. Now we can see by default, the OS disk is being selected. Do you really want to delete the data disks? Now you can choose whether you want to delete the data disk during the deletion of a virtual machine and the network interface cards and the public IP address. So when you select it, so as I said, by default, the data disks is not selected. Only OS disk will be by default will be selected. And we select and say delete call doesn't. The only OS disk will get deleted, but the data disk will not be deleted. Whether the virtual machine, whether the disk is being attached to the VM or not attached, you will be charged for the disk capacity. So don't think that if I delete a virtual machine, Azure is not going to charge for the data disks. As long as the disk exists in the disks, whether you use it, whether you don't use it, whether it has been attached to the VM or not attached to the VM, you will be charged for the capacity and the type of the storage. So you have to be very careful that what is your requirement. And when you don't need the disk, you can delete it from the disk from the Azure so that you will not be charged. So this way you can basically create the data disks and this thing. So when you go to the zone disks, zone redundant, when I go to the virtual machine, when you're creating a disks, now time, down we can see called as a zone redundant disks. So which is premium SSD, standard SSD. There are two different hard disks types are available as of now for zone redundant. Either we can choose a premium SSD or standard SSD. So there is no standard HDD in this one. So we have in standard SSD or we have a premium SSD disks. So you cannot have a standard HDD disk, a zone redundant. So you can create a standard disk or a premium disk to have a zone redundant. Zone redundant. So based on requirement to requirement, we can basically create what type of disk you want it and this one. So that's how we can create disks and we can do that. So let's understand auto shutdown feature. So there is a feature called as an auto shutdown feature on the virtual machine. So when you go to the virtual machine, there is an operations and auto shutdown. So this can be, you create a virtual machine and you want that virtual machine to be shut down, maybe at a specific time automatically. Now, during the creation of that, you created or you're running some kind of a scheduled job and that is going to run for a couple of hours. After that, you don't want the VM to be powered on because it's going to charge. You want to save the cost. So you can enable auto shutdown. So auto enable will automatically shut down the virtual machine if it is being powered on. If it is powered on. If it has already been shut down, it doesn't take any action because the virtual machine is already a shutdown state. If the virtual machine is in a power down state, then the Azure is automatically going to shut down the virtual machine at the specified time. So you can basically specify what time you want it, like at 2 a.m. or a 3 a.m. or whatever that, and based on which time zone you want to have it, then you can specify that. And you want to get a notification before a shutdown, then you can get a notification, you can give it email address and URL, it can send it and you can save it. Now, so this feature sometimes helps you that you power down certain virtual machine after a couple of hours, you want to shut down this machine automatically so that you don't need to come back and shut down the virtual machine. So you can enable this auto shutdown feature. So in the next lesson, we'll try to understand run command, Windows Admin Center and backup features.